Hey guys, welcome to Atlas Archives, where tonight we're visiting the only country that managed to stay independent while Europe was busy collecting African nations like trading cards. Ethiopia, home of Lucy, coffee, and emperors who claim descent from King Solomon, though the paperwork on that last one is admittedly sketchy. From the highlands where humanity first walked upright to the rock churches carved from solid stone, this is a story of ancient kingdoms, legendary resistance, and a calendar that's still living in its own timeline. Let us know what time you're listening from. Chances are our Ethiopian viewers are 7 years younger than the rest of us. So settle in and let's explore the land they call the Roof of Africa. Chapter 1: Land of Origins, Geography and Ancient Foundations. Picture, if you will, a massive chunk of land that decided it was tired of being flat and proceeded to throw itself a geological tantrum of epic proportions. The result? The Ethiopian highlands, often called the Roof of Africa, though given how many roofs Africa seems to have, we're starting to think the continent might be hoarding architectural metaphors. These highlands stretch across much of the country like a massive, rumpled blanket that someone forgot to smooth out after a particularly restless night. The highlands themselves are truly spectacular, rising to heights that would make mountains in other parts of the world feel a bit inadequate. At Ras Dashen, the highest peak reaches 4,550 meters above sea level. That's roughly 14,900 feet for those keeping track. To put that in perspective, it's high enough that if you stacked all the coffee beans Ethiopia has ever produced, you'd still need a very tall ladder to reach the top. The air up there is so thin that even the most seasoned highland dwellers sometimes pause to catch their breath, though whether that's from the altitude or the stunning views remains a matter of scientific debate. But here's where Ethiopia's geography gets particularly interesting, in that delightfully dramatic way that only millions of years of tectonic plates having disagreements can achieve. Running right through the heart of the country is the Great Rift Valley, a geological feature so significant that astronauts can see it from space. It's essentially a massive crack in the Earth's surface, as if some cosmic entity took a very large chisel to the landscape and decided to create the world's most impressive natural highway. This Great Rift Valley is part of a much larger system that stretches from Syria all the way down to Mozambique, roughly 6,400 kilometers of the Earth, essentially having a very slow-motion nervous breakdown. In Ethiopia, this valley splits the highland plateau into two distinct sections, creating what geologists lovingly refer to as the Ethiopian Plateau to the northwest, and various smaller highland regions to the southeast. It's about 80 kilometers wide in most places, which means you could fit several small countries inside it, though we don't recommend trying. The formation of this remarkable feature began about 35 million years ago, when the Arabian and African plates decided they'd had enough of each other's company and started what has been the world's most prolonged and dramatic breakup. The valley continues to widen at a rate of about 5 to 7 millimeters per year, which means that in geological terms, Ethiopia is slowly but surely splitting apart. Don't worry though, at that rate, you'll have plenty of time to finish your vacation. Within this rift valley lies some of Ethiopia's most distinctive landscape features, including a series of lakes that look like nature's own string of pearls. These include Lake Tana, the source of the Blue Nile and the largest lake in Ethiopia, sitting pretty at an elevation of 1,788 meters. The lake is roughly 3,600 square kilometers in size, making it larger than many countries and certainly more scenic than most political boundaries. The climate in Ethiopia is as varied as a highland family gathering. You'll find everything from the scorching heat of the lowlands to the refreshingly cool temperatures of the mountains, with enough variation to satisfy everyone except those people who complain about weather regardless of what it's doing. The country traditionally divides its climate into three main zones, each with its own personality and attitude toward precipitation. First, there's the Dega zone, the cool highlands above 2,600 meters, where temperatures range from near freezing to about 16 degrees Celsius. This is where you'll want to pack a sweater, even if you're visiting from somewhere that considers itself cold. The locals have adapted so well to these conditions that they probably find tropical beaches uncomfortably warm. Night temperatures can drop to the point where you'll see frost at sunrise, which is nature's way of reminding you that Africa isn't always about scorching heat. Then we have the Woina Dega zone, the temperate middle ground between 1,500 and 2,600 meters above sea level. This is Ethiopia's sweet spot climatically speaking, with temperatures ranging between 16 and 30 degrees Celsius. It's here that most of the country's agriculture flourishes, and where the majority of Ethiopians have chosen to make their homes, presumably after trying the alternatives and deciding that moderate temperatures are indeed preferable to being either frozen or roasted. Finally, there's the Collar zone, the hot lowlands below 1,500 meters, where temperatures can climb to 40 degrees Celsius and sometimes beyond. This is where the landscape becomes more arid and dramatic, featuring places like the Danakil Depression, which sits 125 meters below sea level and regularly competes for the title of hottest place on Earth. It's the kind of place that makes you appreciate air conditioning and wonder what early explorers were thinking when they decided to visit. The rainfall patterns in Ethiopia are equally fascinating, governed by the movement of something called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, which sounds like a very important government agency but is actually just meteorology's way of describing where different air masses meet and decide to have lengthy discussions about precipitation. This zone shifts north and south throughout the year, bringing rain to different parts of the country in what locals call the Kiremt, Belg, and Biga seasons. The main rainy season, known as Kiremt, occurs from June to September and is responsible for most of Ethiopia's annual precipitation. During this time, the highlands can receive over 1,200 millimeters of rain per year, while some lucky southwestern areas get more than 2,300 millimeters. The northeastern lowlands, however, receive a more modest 200 to 600 millimeters annually, proving that even within a single country, weather can be remarkably unfair in its distribution. But Ethiopia's claim to fame extends far beyond its dramatic topography and varied climate zones. This is the land where humanity quite literally found its feet, or rather, where scientists found Lucy's feet, along with the rest of her remarkable skeleton. On November 24th, 1974, paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson was working in the Hadar region of the Afar Triangle when he spotted a forearm bone protruding from the ground. What followed was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. Lucy, as she came to be known, named after the Beatles' song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds that was playing in the camp that evening, represented about 40% of the skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis, a species that lived approximately 3.2 million years ago. She was tiny by modern standards, standing just over a metre tall, but her significance was enormous. Lucy provided crucial evidence that our ancestors had learned to walk upright long before they developed larger brains, essentially proving that evolution doesn't always proceed in the order we might expect. The discovery of Lucy and her contemporaries in the Great Rift Valley has led scientists to refer to this region as the cradle of humanity. The valley's unique geological conditions have preserved fossils remarkably, well, creating what is essentially a natural museum of human evolution. Over the past 50 years, researchers have uncovered more fossils of Australopithecus afarensis than any other early human species, with over 400 specimens representing more than 90% of her anatomy. What makes Lucy's story even more remarkable is that her species survived for over 800,000 years, nearly 3 times longer than our own species, Homo sapiens, has been around. They thrived in a landscape that alternated between woodlands and grasslands, adapting to climate changes that would have challenged less resilient species. Their robust jaws and massive cheek teeth suggest they could handle a varied diet, from soft fruits to tough grasses and sedges, making them remarkably adaptable omnivores. But human evolution wasn't the only dramatic story unfolding in ancient Ethiopia. While Lucy's descendants were eventually learning to make tools and control fire, another civilization was rising that would become one of the great powers of the ancient world. The kingdom of Aksum emerged in the highlands of northern Ethiopia around the 1st century CE, growing from earlier Proto-Aksumite civilizations that had been developing in the region for centuries. Aksum was strategically positioned to become a major trading empire, controlling key routes between the Roman Empire, the Middle East, and India. The kingdom's merchants traded everything from gold and ivory to exotic spices and incense, accumulating wealth that would make modern investment bankers weep with envy. At its height, Aksum controlled territory spanning parts of modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Yemen, and southern Saudi Arabia, roughly 2.5 million square kilometers of prime real estate. The Persian prophet Mani, writing in the 3rd century CE, listed Aksum as one of the 4 great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. This wasn't mere diplomatic politeness. Aksum had earned its place on this list through military might, economic prosperity, and cultural achievement. The kingdom minted its own coins in gold, silver, and bronze, developed its own written script called Ge'ez, and constructed massive stone obelisks that still stand today as testament to their engineering prowess. These obelisks, or stelae, are perhaps Aksum's most impressive surviving monuments. The largest still standing rises over 23 meters into the air and is carved to represent a 9-story building, complete with detailed architectural features. These weren't just decorative monuments. They marked the tombs of Aksumite rulers and served as powerful symbols of royal authority. The precision of their carving and the engineering required to erect them demonstrates a level of technological sophistication that would have impressed contemporary Romans. In the 4th century CE, under King Ezana, Aksum became one of the first kingdoms in the world to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion. This wasn't just a political decision. It represented a fundamental transformation of Aksumite society and culture. King Ezana's conversion, influenced by his tutor Saint Frumentius, marked the beginning of Ethiopia's long relationship with Christianity, a relationship that continues to define much of the country's cultural identity today. The archaeological evidence from this period is remarkable. Recent excavations at Beta Samati have revealed what may be the oldest church in sub-Saharan Africa, dating to the 4th century CE. The ruins include elaborate Christian basilicas, alongside evidence of earlier pagan temples, showing how the kingdom navigated its religious transformation. Coins from Ezana's reign tell this story beautifully. Early issues feature pagan symbols like crescents and discs, while later, coins proudly display Christian crosses. Aksum's wealth came from its position at the centre of ancient trade networks. The kingdom's main port at Adulis, on the Red Sea coast, was described by ancient writers as one of the busiest harbours in the known world. Ships arrived daily carrying silk from China, spices from India, and luxury goods from the Mediterranean. In return, they loaded up with African ivory, gold, aromatic resins, and exotic animals that would grace the palaces and amphitheatres of Rome. The kingdom's military power was equally impressive. Aksumite armies conquered the ancient kingdom of Meroe in present-day Sudan, and in the 6th century, King Caleb led an expedition across the Red Sea to Yemen, where he overthrew the Jewish king Du-Nuwas and established Aksumite control over southern Arabia. These weren't mere raids, they were carefully planned military campaigns that extended Aksumite influence across the Red Sea and established the kingdom as a major regional power. The capital city of Aksum itself was a marvel of ancient urban planning. At its peak, the city housed around 20,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Africa at the time. The ruins reveal sophisticated palaces, administrative complexes, and residential areas, all connected by well-planned streets and supplied with water through an ingenious system of channels and reservoirs. The city's layout suggests a highly organized society with clear social hierarchies and efficient governance systems. What's particularly fascinating about Aksumite civilization is how it blended influences from multiple cultures while maintaining its distinct African identity. The kingdom's art and architecture show influences from South Arabia, the Greco-Roman world, and indigenous African traditions, creating a unique synthetic culture that was neither purely African nor merely imitative of foreign models. This cultural fusion is evident in everything from their coinage, which featured Greek inscriptions alongside local languages, to their architectural styles, which incorporated foreign techniques into distinctly local designs. The decline of Aksum beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries CE was as dramatic as its rise had been impressive. The expansion of Islamic power in the Arabian Peninsula cut off many of Aksum's traditional trade routes, while internal pressures from nomadic groups disrupted the kingdom's control over its territories. The loss of revenue from international trade undermined the monarchy's ability to maintain its vast territories, and gradually the kingdom's influence contracted back toward its highland heartland. Yet, Aksum's legacy lived on in ways that shaped Ethiopia for centuries to come. The kingdom's adoption of Christianity created religious traditions that survive today in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Its architectural techniques influenced later Ethiopian building styles, while its written script, Ge'ez, remains the liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity. Perhaps most importantly, Aksum established the idea of a powerful, unified Ethiopian state that could stand as an equal among the great powers of the world. Chapter 2: The Christian Empire, Medieval Ethiopia. As the great kingdom of Aksum faded into the mists of history like a magnificent sunset over the Red Sea, Ethiopia was entering what would become one of its most transformative periods. The medieval era brought not just new dynasties, but an entirely new way of thinking about what it meant to be Ethiopian. This was the age when Christianity didn't just arrive in Ethiopia, it became Ethiopian, taking roots so deeply that it would reshape the very identity of the nation. The transition from ancient to medieval Ethiopia was about as smooth as trying to change clothes while riding a galloping horse. As Aksum's power waned in the 7th and 8th centuries, new peoples rose to prominence in the highlands. The Agau people, who had long lived under Aksumite rule, spent centuries absorbing their overlord's culture. They learned Ge'ez, adopted Christianity, and gradually asserted their own political authority. But before we meet the dynasty that would give us Ethiopia's most spectacular monuments, we must acknowledge one of history's most enigmatic figures. Known to Ethiopian tradition as Gudit, she emerged in the 10th century like a storm that reshapes landscapes. Some say she was Agau, others suggest different origins, but everyone agrees she was definitively anti-Christian in her approach to governance. Gudit's reign was characterized by what can only be described as an aggressive urban renewal program, except instead of building new churches, she specialized in destroying existing ones. Her forces swept through the highlands, targeting Christian institutions with the enthusiasm of someone who had clearly not received the memo about religious tolerance. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had enjoyed centuries of royal patronage, suddenly found itself playing a very high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. The chaos of Gudit's reign lasted for several decades, creating what historians politely call a transitional period, which is academic speak for nobody really knows what was happening, but it probably wasn't pleasant. When the dust settled, a new dynasty had emerged from the mountainous region of Lasta, north of the old Aksumite heartland. These were the Zagwe, and they were about to prove that sometimes the best way to make up for past destruction is through spectacular construction. The Zagwe dynasty, which ruled from approximately 900 to 1270 CE, faced a unique challenge that would make any modern public relations firm break out in cold sweats. They needed to legitimize their rule while distinguishing themselves from the chaos of the preceding period, all while appealing to a population that was deeply committed to Christianity. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity. If you can't claim to be the rightful heirs to political power, become the rightful champions of religious devotion. The Zagwe capital was established at Roha, nestled in the safety of the Lasta Mountains like a jewel hidden in a rocky treasure chest. Here, at an altitude of about 2,480 meters above sea level, they embarked on one of the most ambitious construction projects in medieval history. Except, construction isn't quite the right word, because the Zagwe were less interested in building up than in carving down. The most famous of the Zagwe rulers was King Gebre Meskel Lalibela, who reigned from approximately 1181 to 1221 CE. According to Ethiopian tradition, Lalibela had experienced what can only be described as the ultimate divine inspiration. The story goes that he was taken on a heavenly tour of Jerusalem, complete with what we might today call a very detailed architectural briefing. When he returned to Earth, he had been given the ultimate assignment: build a new Jerusalem right here in the Ethiopian highlands. Now, the timing of this divine commission was rather convenient, because by Lalibela's era, making a pilgrimage to the actual Jerusalem had become roughly as safe as juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle. The Islamic conquests had made Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land extremely difficult, if not impossible, so Lalibela's solution was to bring Jerusalem to Ethiopia, which was certainly more practical than trying to relocate an entire Christian population to the Middle East. What King Lalibela and his successors accomplished at their mountain capital defies both engineering logic and human endurance. They carved 11 complete churches directly out of the living rock, working downward through layers of soft volcanic stone, with tools that would make modern construction workers file a union grievance. These weren't simple caves with religious decorations. They were fully realized architectural masterpieces, complete with pillars, arches, windows, and intricate decorative details. The churches were arranged in 2 main groups, separated by a stream that Lalibela thoughtfully named the River Jordan, because apparently even the local hydrology needed to contribute to the Jerusalem theme. The northern group included 5 churches: Biete Medhani Alem, the House of the Saviour of the World; Biete Mariam, the House of Mary; Biete Maskel, the House of the Cross; Biete Danakil, the House of Virgins; and Biete Golgotha Mikhael, the House of Golgotha Mikhael. The southern complex contained another 5 churches: Biete Emmanuel, Biete Quedus Macorius, Biete Abba Libanos, Biete Gabriel Raphael, and Biete Lehem. And then, standing apart in magnificent isolation like the star of the show, was the 11th church, Biete Georgis, the Church of St. George, shaped like a perfect Greek cross and carved so precisely that it looks like it was designed by angels with engineering degrees. The construction of these churches required not just artistic vision, but engineering genius. The builders had to plan everything in reverse, Instead of building up from foundations, they carved down from ground level, meaning any mistake would be literally set in stone. They created drainage systems to prevent flooding, carved tunnels to connect the churches, and included hermit caves for monks who preferred meditation with complete isolation. Church tradition explains the rapid completion of this monumental project through what might be called Ethiopia's first documented night shift program. According to local legend, after the human workers finished their day's labour, angels would arrive to continue the work, labouring twice as fast as mere mortals. This celestial construction crew supposedly enabled the completion of all 11 churches within King Lalibela's 25-year reign, which would make them the most efficient contractors in history. Modern archaeologists, being somewhat less inclined to accept supernatural explanations for construction schedules, suggest a more gradual timeline. Recent research indicates that the oldest features at Lalibela may date to the 7th or 8th centuries, with successive phases of construction and modification continuing well into the 13th century and beyond. This would make the churches less of a single royal building project and more of a multi-generational religious commitment. The largest church, Biete Medhani Alem, covers approximately 8,000 square feet and rises 4 stories, making it larger than many modern churches and infinitely more impressive given that it was carved from a single piece of rock. The precision is extraordinary. Windows are perfectly aligned, pillars geometrically precise, and decorative elements show influences from Aksumite traditions, Syrian Christianity, and local innovation. What made these churches particularly remarkable was not just their architectural achievement, but their symbolic importance. Lalibela was designed as a complete religious landscape, with features corresponding to biblical sites. There were hills named Calvary and Golgotha, a tomb of Adam, and even olive groves supposedly planted with olives from the Garden of Gethsemane. The entire complex was intended to allow Ethiopian Christians to experience the geography of their faith without the dangerous journey to Palestine. The artistic program of the churches was equally sophisticated. Biete Golgotha features life-sized carvings of saints on its walls and is believed to contain the tomb of King Lalibela himself, who was eventually venerated as a saint. The churches contain elaborate religious symbolism, with crosses appearing not just as decorative elements but as the actual floor plans of some buildings. Every aspect of the design was intended to create a sense of sacred space that would transport worshippers into the presence of the divine. The Zagwe achievement at Lalibela represented more than just architectural innovation. It marked a fundamental transformation in Ethiopian Christianity. While Aksum had been Christian, the Zagwe made Christianity specifically Ethiopian. They created a pilgrimage site that rivaled Jerusalem itself, established monastic traditions that would endure for centuries, and developed artistic styles that blended international influences with distinctly local sensibilities. However, the Zagwe dynasty's hold on power was always somewhat tenuous. Their legitimacy rested primarily on religious achievement rather than political tradition, and opposition was growing among other groups who claimed more ancient rights to rule. The Amhara people of Shiwa province, in particular, were beginning to assert claims based on supposed descent from the old Aksumite royal house. The end of Zagwe rule came in 1270 CE, when a nobleman named Yakuno Amlak led a successful rebellion against the last Zagwe king, Yitbarek. This wasn't just a simple palace coup, it was the beginning of what would become one of the longest-lasting dynasties in world history. Yakuno Amlak and his supporters claimed that the Zagwe had been usurpers, illegitimate rulers who had stolen the throne from its rightful owners. To legitimize his takeover, Yakuno Amlak promoted a genealogy that connected him directly to the ancient Aksumite royal house, and through them to the legendary Menelik I, supposedly the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This claim was codified in the 14th century text known as the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of the Kings, which became Ethiopia's national epic and the foundational text of what historians call the Solomonic dynasty. The Kebra Nagast tells one of history's most romantic royal origin stories. According to this text, the Queen of Sheba, identified as Queen Makeda of Ethiopia, travelled to Jerusalem to visit the famously wise King Solomon. During her stay, the two monarchs became romantically involved, and the queen returned to Ethiopia carrying Solomon's child. This child, Menelik I, became the founder of the Ethiopian royal line, establishing a direct connection between the Ethiopian throne and the biblical House of David. Modern historians regard this story as a medieval political myth designed to legitimize Yakuno Amlak's dynasty, which is accurate but considerably less romantic. The claim to Solomonic descent served multiple purposes. It connected Ethiopia to the Judeo-Christian tradition, provided religious legitimacy for political rule, and suggested Ethiopian monarchy was part of God's plan for humanity's salvation. The new Solomonic dynasty established itself in the Amhara heartland of Shewa, marking a geographical shift in Ethiopian political power. Unlike their predecessors, who had ruled from fixed capitals, the early Solomonic emperors adopted a peripatetic court system, moving constantly throughout their territories with a massive entourage that could include tens of thousands of people. This mobile capital, known as the Katama, allowed the emperor to maintain personal control over distant provinces while consuming local resources rather than draining the royal treasury. Under Yakuno Amlak and his successors, Ethiopia began a new phase of territorial expansion. The early Solomonic emperors pushed boundaries southward and eastward, bringing new peoples under imperial control. This expansion wasn't just about political domination. It was about spreading Ethiopian Christianity and creating a unified state based on shared religious values. The reign of Amda Seyon, who ruled from 1314 to 1344, marked a particularly aggressive phase of Solomonic expansion. He campaigned in all directions, establishing Ethiopian control over trade routes to the Red Sea, conquering territory in the south, and fighting bitter wars against the Islamic sultanates that were emerging along Ethiopia's eastern borders. His military campaigns established a pattern of Christian-Muslim competition that would define much of Ethiopia's subsequent history. The Solomonic system of governance relied heavily on the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, creating an intimate relationship between religious and political authority that would characterize Ethiopian civilization for centuries. Emperors claimed divine sanction for their rule, while the Church provided the ideological framework that justified imperial expansion and centralized control. This church-state alliance created a distinctly Ethiopian form of Christian civilization that was unlike anything else in medieval Africa. The cultural achievements of the Solomonic period were equally impressive. The 14th and 15th centuries saw a flowering of Ethiopian literature, art, and religious thought. Monasteries became centers of learning and manuscript production, creating illuminated books that rank among the finest medieval art produced anywhere. The distinctive Ethiopian artistic style, with its bold colors and stylized figures, reached full maturity during this period. By the end of the medieval period, Ethiopia had established itself as a unique civilization that combined African, Semitic, and Christian elements into something entirely new. The churches of Lalibela still drew pilgrims from across the Christian world, while the Solomonic emperors ruled over a vast highland empire stretching from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we can imagine the sound of chisels ringing against volcanic rock in the mountains of Luster, where medieval craftsmen were carving a new Jerusalem from the living stone. Picture the endless processions of pilgrims making their way to these mountain churches, their white robes gleaming against the red earth of the highlands. This was medieval Ethiopia at its most magnificent, a Christian empire that had learned to carve its faith into the very bedrock of Africa. Chapter 3: Isolation and Awakening. Early Modern Period. As the medieval period drew to a close, Ethiopia was about to embark on one of the most dramatic chapters in its long history. The early modern era would see the arrival of European missionaries with grand ambitions, a period of such profound isolation that it makes modern hermit kingdoms look sociable, and finally, a remarkable awakening under leaders who decided that Ethiopia needed to modernize or risk becoming a historical footnote. It's a story of clash between old and new, east and west, and one man's stubborn refusal to answer his mail. The first major encounter between medieval Ethiopia and the wider world came in the form of Portuguese explorers and missionaries who arrived in the 16th century with the enthusiasm of tourists who had taken a very wrong turn but decided to make the best of it. The Portuguese had been searching for the legendary Prester John, a mythical Christian king supposedly ruling somewhere in the east, and when they discovered Ethiopia, they convinced themselves they had found their man. The initial Portuguese contact was welcome, coming during one of Ethiopia's most desperate hours. In the 1520s and 30s, the Ethiopian highlands were under assault from the Muslim forces of Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known as Ahmad Gragn, or the Left-Handed. His armies had conquered most Christian territories and seemed poised to end Ethiopian independence permanently. When a Portuguese military force arrived in 1541 under Cristóvão da Gama, they were greeted as potential saviours. The Portuguese intervention proved decisive in the Ethiopian victory over Ahmad Gragn's forces in 1543, establishing a bond of gratitude that would soon prove more complicated than anyone anticipated. Having saved Ethiopia from Muslim conquest, the Portuguese felt they had earned the right to save Ethiopian souls from what they perceived as orthodox heresy. This was the beginning of one of history's most ambitious missionary projects, and one of its most spectacular failures. The Jesuit mission that began in earnest in 1557 was initially led by Father Andrés de Oviedo, who arrived with the optimistic goal of converting an entire Christian empire to Roman Catholicism. The Jesuits were products of the Counter-Reformation, that great Catholic revival movement that combined spiritual renewal with the diplomatic subtlety of a sledgehammer. They approached their Ethiopian mission with the confident assumption that Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity was merely Catholicism that had gotten confused about a few details. The early years of the Jesuit mission were marked by theological debates that must have resembled extremely polite academic conferences. If academic conferences occasionally resulted in people being sent into exile or having their books burned, the Ethiopian Orthodox clergy proved surprisingly resistant to helpful corrections about their theology, and the initial Jesuit mission found itself confined largely to ministering to the remaining Portuguese soldiers and their families. By the end of the 16th century, the mission had nearly collapsed, but then, in a development that proved that sometimes persistence pays off, and sometimes it really doesn't, the Spanish crown decided to revive the Ethiopian mission with new energy and new missionaries. The most famous of these was Father Pedro Paez, who arrived in 1603 and would prove to be both more diplomatically skilled and ultimately more successful than his predecessors. Paez was a remarkable figure, part missionary, part diplomat, part architect, and part storyteller. He learned to speak Amharic fluently, gained access to the royal court, and even managed to become something of a confidant to Emperor Susenyos. More importantly, he converted Susenyos's brother, Ras Sela Krestos, to Catholicism, creating a powerful advocate for the Jesuit cause within the royal family itself. The breakthrough came in 1621 when Emperor Susenyos publicly announced his conversion to Catholicism. This wasn't just a personal spiritual decision, it was a calculated political move designed to strengthen royal power against the influential Orthodox clergy. Susenyos apparently believed that aligning with the Pope would give him access to European military technology and diplomatic support, while reducing the political influence of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. What followed can only be described as a masterclass in how not to manage religious reform. In 1626, the new Catholic Patriarch Afonso Mendes arrived with instructions to rapidly Catholicize Ethiopia. Mendes approached this task with all the cultural sensitivity of a demolition crew. He demanded that Ethiopian clergy be reordained according to Catholic rites, that the entire population be rebaptized, and that traditional Ethiopian religious practices be abandoned in favor of European customs. The Ethiopian response to these demands was about as enthusiastic as one might expect from a population being told that their 1,000-year-old religious traditions were wrong. What began as religious resistance quickly escalated into civil war, with Orthodox clergy leading popular uprisings against the emperor and his Catholic allies. The countryside erupted in religious violence that made the 30 Years' War look like a theological discussion. By 1632, it had become clear that the Jesuit experiment was not just failing, but was actively destroying the country. Emperor Susenyos, faced with the choice between maintaining his Catholic faith and maintaining his kingdom, chose pragmatically. In one of history's great reversals, he publicly renounced Catholicism and ordered the expulsion of all Jesuit missionaries from Ethiopia. His son and successor, Fasilide, completed the break by establishing a new capital at Gondar and implementing a policy of strict isolation from European contact. The period that followed the Jesuit expulsion is known as the Gondarine era, named after the new capital that Fasilides established in the 1630s. Gondar became a remarkable synthesis of Ethiopian and foreign architectural influences, featuring castles and palaces that showed clear Portuguese and Indian influences, while remaining distinctly Ethiopian in character. The city served as Ethiopia's permanent capital for nearly 2 centuries, something of a novelty for a country that had traditionally favoured mobile royal courts. But the Gondarine period's most significant characteristic was Ethiopia's deliberate withdrawal from contact with the outside world. Having been burned by their experience with European missionaries, Ethiopian emperors adopted a policy of isolation so complete that it makes Japan's Sakoku policy look like an open-door immigration system. For nearly 2 centuries, Ethiopia effectively closed itself off from European contact, creating what historians call a hermit kingdom in the Horn of Africa. This isolation was not merely diplomatic but psychological. The trauma of the Jesuit period had convinced Ethiopian leaders that foreign contact inevitably led to foreign domination, and that the only way to preserve Ethiopian independence was to avoid foreigners altogether. When European travellers occasionally made it to Ethiopia, they were often treated with deep suspicion and sometimes imprisoned for years. The long-term consequences of this isolation proved devastating. While Europe was experiencing the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, Ethiopia was deliberately cutting itself off from these developments. The country that had once been a major player in international trade and diplomacy gradually fell behind the rapidly advancing European powers. By the middle of the 18th century, Ethiopia was entering what historians call the Zemene Mesafint, or Era of the Princes. This was a period when the central authority of the emperor effectively collapsed, and regional warlords carved up the country into competing fiefdoms. The emperors became mere figureheads confined to Gondar, while real power lay in the hands of provincial nobles who fought constant wars against each other. The Zemene Mesafint lasted from approximately 1769 to 1855, a period that saw 23 different emperors occupy the throne, many multiple times as they were installed, deposed, and reinstalled by competing warlords. It was a time of remarkable political instability that would have given Game of Thrones writers enough material for several more seasons. During this period, Ethiopia resembled a medieval feudal state more than a unified empire. Regional lords controlled their territories as independent kingdoms, maintaining armies, collecting taxes, and conducting foreign policies. The emperor's authority rarely extended beyond Gondar's walls, and even within the capital, real power often lay with whichever regional strongman currently controlled the palace. The fragmentation of Ethiopia during the Simien Mesafint had profound economic and social consequences. Trade routes became unsafe, agriculture suffered from constant warfare, and the country's infrastructure deteriorated. The isolation that had once been a matter of policy became a matter of circumstance, as Ethiopia lacked the political stability necessary for meaningful international engagement. Yet even during this period of chaos, Ethiopian culture and learning continued to flourish in monasteries and royal courts. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained its educational traditions, and regional courts competed in patronizing artists, scholars, and craftsmen. It was during the Simien Mesafint that some of Ethiopia's finest historical chronicles were written, often by monks who had witnessed the dramatic events they recorded. The end of the Simien Mesafint came with the rise of one of Ethiopia's most remarkable rulers, Kassa Hailu, who would become known to history as Emperor Tewodros II. Born around 1818 in the remote region of Kwara, Kassa was not of royal blood, but he possessed the vision and military skill necessary to reunify Ethiopia under central authority. Kassa's rise to power was the stuff of legend. Starting as a minor bandit leader, he gradually built a following among peasants and disaffected soldiers who were tired of the endless warfare between regional nobles. Unlike the traditional princes who fought for personal power, Kassa claimed to fight for a unified Ethiopia that could stand as an equal among the great powers of the world. Between 1852 and 1855, Kassa fought a series of brilliant military campaigns that gradually brought all of northern Ethiopia under his control. His victory at the Battle of Derashge in February 1855 effectively ended the Simien Mesafint and established him as Emperor Tewodros II. With his coronation, Ethiopia entered the modern era. Tewodros II was a visionary who understood that Ethiopia could not remain isolated forever. He recognized that the country needed to modernize its military, its administration, and its technology if it was to maintain its independence in a world increasingly dominated by European colonial powers. His reign marked Ethiopia's first serious attempt at modernization, and while it ultimately ended in tragedy, it established patterns that his successors would follow. The new emperor began by attempting to create a centralized administration with appointed governors rather than hereditary regional rulers. He established a professional army with standardized training and equipment, and he actively sought European technical assistance to help modernize Ethiopian industry and infrastructure. Most remarkably for an African ruler in the 1850s, he reached out to European powers as potential partners rather than masters, seeking technological cooperation while maintaining Ethiopian sovereignty. Unfortunately, Tewodros II's diplomatic skills did not match his military abilities. His famous letter to Queen Victoria in 1862, proposing an alliance between Britain and Ethiopia, went unanswered by the British Foreign Office. Whether this was due to bureaucratic oversight, diplomatic arrogance, or simple racism remains unclear, but the slight had devastating consequences for Anglo-Ethiopian relations. When his diplomatic overtures were ignored, Tewodros's frustration turned to anger, and his anger led to a series of increasingly irrational decisions. He began taking European residents of Ethiopia hostage, demanding responses to his letters and recognition of Ethiopian sovereignty. What had begun as a reasonable diplomatic initiative gradually escalated into an international crisis that would ultimately destroy both Tewodros and his modernization program. The British response to Tewodros's hostage-taking was swift and overwhelming. In 1868, a massive Anglo-Indian military expedition under Sir Robert Napier landed on the Red Sea coast and marched inland toward the Emperor's mountain fortress at Magdala. The expedition included 13,000 soldiers, 26,000 camp followers, making it one of the largest military operations in 19th century Africa. The Battle of Magdala on April 10, 1868, was a devastating demonstration of the gap between European and African military technology. Tewodros's forces, armed primarily with traditional weapons, were annihilated by British artillery and modern rifles. Rather than face capture and the humiliation of defeat, Emperor Tewodros II committed suicide on April 13th, ending both his reign and his dreams of a modernized Ethiopia. The British expedition withdrew after looting Magdala's treasures, taking hundreds of ancient manuscripts and artifacts that remain in British museums today. They also took Tewodros's young son, Prince Alamehu, who was raised in Britain under Queen Victoria's protection, but died at 18, forever separated from his homeland. Despite its tragic end, Tewodros II's reign marked a crucial turning point in Ethiopian history. He had demonstrated both the necessity and possibility of Ethiopian modernization, and his example would inspire successors to continue building a strong, unified, and independent Ethiopia. The era of isolation was over, and Ethiopia was ready to engage with the modern world on its own terms. As we settle into sleep tonight, we can imagine Emperor Tewodros standing on the battlements of Magdala, looking out over the highlands he had fought to unite, knowing that his vision of a modern Ethiopia would outlive his own tragic end. His story reminds us that sometimes the greatest failures plant the seeds of eventual success, and that the path to the future often requires travelling through very dark valleys indeed. Chapter 4: The Lion's Resistance, Colonial Period and Independence. The tragic end of Emperor Tewodros II might have seemed like the conclusion of Ethiopia's modernization dreams, but history has a way of turning apparent endings into new beginnings. The late 19th century would witness the rise of one of Africa's greatest leaders, a victory that would echo across continents, and a resistance to colonialism so successful that it would become a symbol of hope for oppressed peoples everywhere. This is the story of how Ethiopia not only survived the scramble for Africa, but emerged as the only nation south of the Sahara to defeat European colonialism at the height of its power. Following the chaos at Magdala, Ethiopia once again faced the familiar challenge of selecting a new emperor from competing claimants. After a brief period of confusion, the throne passed to Johannes IV, a ruler from Tigray who proved capable of maintaining Ethiopian unity against external threats. But it was his successor, Menelik II, who would transform Ethiopia from a collection of feuding provinces into a modern empire capable of standing among the great powers of the world. Menelik II began his reign as King of Shewa in 1865, long before he became Emperor of all Ethiopia. Even as a regional ruler, he demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that would later make him famous. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed European contact with suspicion, Menelik understood that Ethiopia's survival in the modern world would depend on mastering European technology while maintaining Ethiopian independence. He was perhaps the first African ruler to recognize that the choice was not between tradition and modernity, but between technological adaptation and national extinction. When Menelik became emperor in 1889, he inherited a country that was still largely feudal but increasingly threatened by European colonial expansion. The scramble for Africa was in full swing, with European powers carving up the continent. most African leaders found themselves forced to choose between submission or destruction. Menelik chose a third option. He would out-European the Europeans at their own game. The foundation of Menelik's strategy was military modernization on a scale that would have impressed Tewodros II. Unlike his predecessor, however, Menelik approached modernization with diplomatic subtlety rather than emotional outbursts. He cultivated relationships with multiple European powers, playing them against each other while accumulating the weapons and technology Ethiopia needed for its defense. By the 1890s, Ethiopian forces were armed with modern rifles and artillery that matched or exceeded anything the Europeans could bring to bear in Africa. The test of this strategy came through Ethiopia's relationship with Italy, which had established the colony of Eritrea on the Red Sea coast and harboured ambitions for further expansion. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Wuchale, which was supposed to establish friendly relations between the two countries. However, the treaty contained a critical difference between the Italian and Amharic versions that would have profound consequences. The Italian version stated that Ethiopia would conduct its foreign relations through Italy, essentially making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version said Ethiopia could use Italy for foreign relations if it chose, preserving Ethiopian sovereignty. Whether this difference was translation error, diplomatic deception, or deliberate ambiguity remains unclear, but when Italy began treating Ethiopia as its protectorate, Menelik formally repudiated the treaty in 1893. Italy's response was predictable. If Ethiopia would not accept protectorate status voluntarily, it would be imposed by force. In October 1895, Italian forces began advancing south from Eritrea, confident that European military superiority would quickly overwhelm what they assumed to be a disorganized African resistance. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi assured the Italian parliament that the campaign would be over in a matter of weeks, with Ethiopia joining the growing list of European colonies in Africa. The Italians could hardly have been more wrong. Menelik's response to the Italian invasion was a masterpiece of strategic mobilization. He issued a proclamation that has become one of the great calls to resistance in African history. All men and boys able to carry a spear go to Addis Ababa. Every married man will bring his wife to cook and wash for him. Every unmarried man will bring any unmarried woman he can find to cook and wash for him. Women with babies, the blind, and those too aged and infirm to carry a spear are excused. Anyone found at home after receiving this order will be hanged. This mobilization was extraordinary, not just for its scale, but for its unifying effect on Ethiopian society. Regional rivalries that had dominated Ethiopian politics for centuries were temporarily set aside as the entire country rallied to resist foreign invasion. From every corner of the empire, warriors marched toward the northern frontiers, creating an army that numbered over 100,000 men. Most remarkably, this force was well armed with modern weapons. The Italian force advancing to meet this Ethiopian army numbered approximately 17,000 men under General Oreste Baratieri. While smaller than the Ethiopian army, the Italians possessed superior artillery and were confident that European discipline and tactics would overcome any numerical disadvantage. They had, after all, the examples of numerous colonial victories across Africa, where small European forces had consistently defeated much larger African armies. The two armies met near the town of Adwa on March 1st, 1896, in what would become one of the most significant battles in modern African history. The engagement began when General Baratieri, under pressure from Rome to achieve a quick victory, ordered a night advance to establish favourable positions. However, the difficult terrain and poor maps led to confusion among the Italian columns, which became separated and lost communication with each other. When dawn broke, the Ethiopians found themselves facing 3 isolated Italian brigades rather than a coordinated army. Menelik seized the initiative immediately, ordering attacks that prevented the Italians from reuniting their forces. The Ethiopian strategy was brutally effective. Surround each Italian column and engage them in close-quarters combat where European advantages in artillery and long-range weapons would be neutralized. The Battle of Adwa was a catastrophe for Italy and a triumph beyond Ethiopian dreams. By the end of the day, over 6,000 Italian and colonial troops were dead, with another 4,000 captured. Ethiopian casualties were also heavy, but the strategic result was overwhelming. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia had been completely defeated. General Baratieri fled to Eritrea with the remnants of his army, while Emperor Menelik found himself in possession of vast quantities of modern weapons and equipment abandoned by the retreating Italians. The news of Adwa sent shockwaves around the world. For the first time since the beginning of the scramble for Africa, a European colonial army had been decisively defeated by African forces. In Italy, the defeat led to the fall of Crispi's government and widespread questioning of the colonial enterprise. In Ethiopia, the victory established Menelik as a ruler worthy of respect from European powers. More importantly, Adwa became a symbol of African resistance and capability that resonated far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Across Africa and throughout the African diaspora, news of the Ethiopian victory inspired hope and pride. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that Adwa was the one bright star in a continent of darkness, while Marcus Garvey later proclaimed that Ethiopia's victory proved that Africans could successfully resist European domination if properly organized and armed. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in October 1896, formally ended the war and recognized Ethiopian independence. Italy retained control of Eritrea, but abandoned all claims to Ethiopian territory. More significantly, the treaty established Ethiopia as a recognized member of the international community, with European powers rushing to establish diplomatic relations with Menelik's government. Menelik used the years following Adwa to continue his modernization program and expand Ethiopian territory to roughly its present borders. He built roads, established schools, founded Addis Ababa as a modern capital, and even authorized the construction of a railway to the French port of Djibouti. By the time of his death in 1913, Ethiopia had been transformed from a feudal kingdom into a modern empire that commanded international respect. The succession to Menelik brought another remarkable figure to Ethiopian leadership. After a period of political uncertainty, Ras Tafari Makonnen emerged as regent and heir apparent in 1916, eventually being crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I in 1930. Like Menelik before him, Haile Selassie was committed to Ethiopian modernization, but he would face challenges that his predecessor could hardly have imagined. Haile Selassie's early reign was marked by continued efforts at modernization, including the promulgation of Ethiopia's first written constitution in 1931 and Ethiopia's admission to the League of Nations in 1923. He established schools and hospitals, built roads and communication networks, and worked to abolish slavery throughout the empire. His vision was of an Ethiopia that could take its place among the modern nations of the world while maintaining its ancient Christian heritage. However, the rise of fascism in Europe created new threats to Ethiopian independence. Benito Mussolini's Italy harbored deep resentment over the humiliation of Adwa and sought to establish an African empire that would restore Italian prestige. The global economic depression of the early 1930s provided Mussolini with the domestic justification he needed for an aggressive foreign policy, while the weakness of the League of Nations made Ethiopia appear vulnerable to renewed attack. The second Italian invasion of Ethiopia began in October 1935, and this time Italy came prepared for serious warfare. Mussolini committed over 400,000 troops to the campaign, equipped with modern weapons, aircraft, and poison gas. Unlike the overconfident expedition of 1896, This was a full-scale military operation designed to overwhelm Ethiopian resistance through sheer force and technological superiority. Despite his best efforts, Haile Selassie found himself fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. Ethiopian forces fought bravely, but they could not match the Italian advantage in aircraft, artillery, and chemical weapons. The Italian use of mustard gas was particularly devastating, violating international law but proving terribly effective against Ethiopian troops who lacked protective equipment. As Italian forces advanced toward Addis Ababa, Haile Selassie made the difficult decision to leave Ethiopia and appeal to the international community for assistance. His speech to the League of Nations in June 1936 was one of the most powerful addresses in that organization's history. Standing before an assembly that included representatives of the European powers that had carved up Africa, he declared, "I declare in the face of the whole world that the Emperor, the government and the people of Ethiopia will not bow before force, that they maintain their claims that they will use all means in their power to ensure the triumph of right and the respect of the covenant." The League's response was ineffective sanctions that failed to deter Italian aggression. European democracies were reluctant to confront fascism directly, while some even saw Italian control of Ethiopia as preferable to continued independence for an African state. Haile Selassie was forced into exile in England, while Mussolini proclaimed the establishment of Italian East Africa, uniting Ethiopia with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland under a single colonial administration. Italian rule in Ethiopia proved both harsh and brief. The occupation government implemented racist policies that treated Ethiopians as inferior subjects, while Italian settlers were encouraged to emigrate to the conquered territory. However, Ethiopian resistance never entirely ceased, and the difficult terrain made complete Italian control impossible to achieve. The situation changed dramatically with the outbreak of World War II. When Italy entered the war on Germany's side in June 1940, Ethiopia suddenly became a British ally. British forces began supporting Ethiopian resistance movements, while Haile Selassie returned to lead the liberation campaign. The combination of British military assistance and Ethiopian guerrilla warfare proved devastating to Italian forces, who were already overstretched by global war. On May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years after Italian forces had entered Addis Ababa, Emperor Haile Selassie returned triumphantly to his capital. The symbolism of the date was deliberate. Ethiopia had not only regained its independence but had done so on the anniversary of its conquest. Once again, Ethiopia had demonstrated that African peoples could successfully resist European domination when properly organized and supported. The Ethiopian experience during the colonial period was unique in Africa, but its significance extended far beyond a single country's borders. Ethiopia's successful resistance to colonialism provided inspiration for independence movements across the continent, while its maintenance of sovereignty offered proof that African states could function as equals in the international community. The legacy of Adwa and the resistance to Italian occupation became central elements of Ethiopian national identity, but they also contributed to broader African consciousness. The success of Ethiopian resistance demonstrated that European colonialism was not inevitable, that African peoples possessed the capability for effective organization, and that independence remained a realistic goal for colonized peoples everywhere. As we drift towards sleep tonight, we can imagine the sound of war drums echoing across the hills of Adwa, where Ethiopian warriors prepared to defend their homeland against impossible odds. Picture Emperor Haile Selassie standing before the League of Nations, speaking truth to power with a dignity that shamed more powerful nations into silence. These moments remind us that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by the strongest armies, but by those with the greatest determination to remain free. Chapter 5. Revolution and Turmoil, Modern Political History. The return of Emperor Haile Selassie to his throne in 1941 seemed to promise a new golden age for Ethiopia. The country that had successfully resisted Italian colonialism appeared ready to take its place among the modern nations of the world. Yet within 3 decades, this ancient monarchy would collapse in one of Africa's bloodiest revolutions, ushering in an era of ideological warfare, devastating famine, and human suffering that would test the Ethiopian people beyond all endurance. This is the story of how a nation's greatest triumphs can plant the seeds of its deepest tragedies. The post-war period initially brought remarkable progress to Ethiopia. Haile Selassie embraced modernization with renewed energy, establishing Ethiopia's first university, founding the Organization of African Unity with its headquarters in Addis Ababa, and positioning himself as a leader of the developing world. Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and independence, while the emperor himself was revered not only by his own people but by Rastafarians in Jamaica who regarded him as a divine figure. Yet beneath this impressive facade, serious problems were accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon. Ethiopia remained essentially a feudal society where a tiny elite controlled vast estates, while millions of peasants lived in grinding poverty. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of the imperial family, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and a small number of aristocratic landlords, leaving ordinary farmers as tenants who surrendered most of their harvest to their overlords. The emperor's modernization efforts, while genuine, were largely confined to urban areas and failed to address the fundamental inequalities that characterized Ethiopian society. Students at the new Addis Ababa University began to study Marxist ideology and to question why their country, despite its proud history of independence, remained trapped in poverty and underdevelopment. The famous student slogan, "Land to the tiller," became a rallying cry for those who demanded radical reform. By the early 1970s, these underlying tensions were reaching a breaking point. A devastating famine in the northern provinces of Wollo and Tigray in 1973 killed an estimated 100,000 people, yet the imperial government's response was slow and inadequate. Even more damaging to the emperor's reputation was the revelation that he had been spending enormous sums on palace ceremonies while his people starved. The contrast between imperial luxury and popular suffering became impossible to ignore. The revolution that would ultimately destroy the monarchy began not in the universities or among political activists, but in the barracks of the Ethiopian army. In February 1974, soldiers at a remote military base began mutinying over poor pay, inadequate food, and appalling living conditions. What started as a protest about practical grievances quickly spread throughout the military, as officers and enlisted men alike began to question the entire structure of Ethiopian society. These military mutinies evolved into what became known as the creeping coup, a gradual process by which the armed forces methodically dismantled the imperial system over a period of 7 months. The military formed a coordinating committee known as the Derg, an Amharic word meaning committee, which initially presented itself as a group of patriotic officers seeking to reform rather than destroy the monarchy. The Derg's approach was initially cautious and systematic. They began by arresting corrupt officials and demanding reforms from the emperor, who seemed willing to make concessions in order to preserve his throne. Throughout the spring and summer of 1974, Haile Selassie agreed to a series of reforms, including the establishment of a constitutional monarchy and the dismissal of unpopular ministers. However, these reforms came too late to save the monarchy. On September 12, 1974, the Derg finally moved against the emperor himself, deposing the 82-year-old monarch and placing him under house arrest in his own palace. The fall of Haile Selassie marked the end of one of the world's oldest continuous monarchies and the beginning of one of Africa's most turbulent political experiments. Initially, many Ethiopians welcomed the revolution with enthusiasm. The Derg promised land reform, social justice, and an end to the corruption and inequality that had characterized the imperial regime. Students, workers, and intellectuals celebrated what appeared to be the dawn of a new and more equitable Ethiopia. Even international observers initially viewed the Ethiopian revolution as a potentially positive development that might bring long overdue social progress to one of Africa's poorest countries. However, the revolutionary honeymoon proved tragically brief. The Derg quickly revealed itself to be not a democratic reform movement, but a military dictatorship with an appetite for power and violence that would eventually exceed even that of the regime it had overthrown. The committee began by eliminating potential rivals within the military itself, executing General Aman Andom and 60 other high-ranking officials in what became known as the Massacre of the 60. From this bloody beginning emerged one of Ethiopia's most notorious figures, Mengistu Haile Mariam, a relatively junior officer who possessed the ruthless cunning necessary to outmaneuver his rivals and seize control of the revolution. Through a combination of political skill and targeted assassinations, Mengistu gradually eliminated his competitors within the Derg and emerged as Ethiopia's undisputed leader by 1977. Under Mengistu's leadership, Ethiopia embarked on a radical experiment in Marxist-Leninist revolution. The new regime abolished private property, nationalized all land and industry, and declared its intention to build a socialist paradise in the Horn of Africa. These policies were implemented with Soviet advisors and Cuban military support, as Ethiopia aligned itself firmly with the communist bloc during the height of the Cold War. Yet the reality of Mengistu's revolution was far removed from any socialist ideal. Beginning in 1976, the regime launched the Kishibir, or Red Terror, a campaign of systematic violence against anyone suspected of opposing the government. The Red Terror targeted not only obvious enemies of the regime, but also rival Marxist groups, students, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens who fell under suspicion for the most trivial reasons. The scale and brutality of the Red Terror was shocking, even by the standards of 20th century political violence. Government forces conducted mass executions in public squares, displayed the bodies of victims in the streets as warnings to potential opponents, and encouraged children to inform on their parents and teachers. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, but even conservative figures suggest that tens of thousands of people were murdered during this campaign, with some estimates reaching as high as 750,000. The Red Terror was not merely a campaign of random violence, but a systematic attempt to destroy any potential opposition to Mengistu's rule. The regime particularly targeted educated urban youth, viewing students and intellectuals as the most dangerous threats to their power. Addis Ababa University, once a symbol of Ethiopia's modernization, became a hunting ground where students were arrested, tortured, and executed for the crime of independent thinking. While the government was terrorizing its own population, Ethiopia also faced a series of external challenges that further destabilized the country. Separatist movements in Eritrea and Tigray launched armed insurgencies against the central government, while Somalia invaded the Ogaden region in 1977 in an attempt to seize Ethiopian territory inhabited by ethnic Somalis. The war with Somalia presented Mengistu with his greatest military challenge, but it also provided him with an opportunity to consolidate his power and gain international legitimacy. When the Soviet Union abandoned its former ally Somalia to support Ethiopia, Mengistu found himself with access to massive quantities of modern weapons and thousands of Cuban military advisors. This support enabled Ethiopian forces to defeat the Somali invasion, but at the cost of making Ethiopia dependent on Soviet aid and increasingly isolated from the Western world. The human cost of Mengistu's revolution became truly catastrophic during the Great Famine of 1984 to 1985. Drought alone did not cause this disaster. It was the product of government policies that prioritized military spending over agricultural development and used food as a weapon against areas controlled by rebel movements. The regime spent nearly half of Ethiopia's budget on military expenses, while allocating minimal resources to preventing or responding to famine. When the famine reached critical proportions, affecting over 7 million people in northern Ethiopia, Mengistu's government initially tried to conceal the crisis from the outside world. The regime feared that international attention would legitimize the rebel movements operating in the affected areas and undermine the government's claims to be building a workers' paradise. Only when BBC television crews managed to document the scale of the suffering did the outside world become aware of the catastrophe unfolding in Ethiopia. The international response to the Ethiopian famine was unprecedented in its scale and emotional impact. Bob Geldof's Live Aid concerts raised over $150 million for famine relief, while governments around the world sent emergency food supplies. However, much of this aid was manipulated by the Ethiopian government for political purposes, with food shipments being used to support forced resettlement programs that moved hundreds of thousands of people from rebel-controlled areas to regions where they could be more easily controlled. The famine represented the moral bankruptcy of Mengistu's regime and marked the beginning of its decline. International criticism mounted as evidence emerged that the government was using humanitarian aid as a weapon against its own people, while rebel movements gained strength in areas devastated by hunger and government neglect. The very policies that were supposed to build socialism in Ethiopia had instead created unprecedented human suffering. By the late 1980s, the Ethiopian revolution was clearly failing on every level. The economy was in ruins, with agricultural production declining and industry collapsing under the weight of ideological dogma and mismanagement. The military was fighting insurgencies on multiple fronts while hemorrhaging resources and manpower. Most seriously for Mengistu, the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was no longer willing to provide unlimited support for expensive client states in Africa. The end came with surprising speed. In 1989, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front formed a coalition with other rebel groups called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. This coalition launched a coordinated offensive that quickly overwhelmed government forces, demoralized by years of futile warfare and economic collapse. Province after province fell to rebel control as the Ethiopian army disintegrated. On May 28, 1991, rebel forces entered Addis Ababa without opposition. Mengistu had fled the country just days before, abandoning his revolution and seeking asylum in Zimbabwe, where he would live in comfortable exile for decades to come. The man who had promised to transform Ethiopia into a socialist paradise left behind a country devastated by war, famine, and political terror. The Ethiopian revolution that began with such hope in 1974 had ultimately cost the lives of over 1 million people through violence, famine, and war. It represented one of the great tragedies of 20th century Africa, demonstrating how quickly noble ideals can be corrupted by the pursuit of power and how devastating the consequences can be when governments wage war against their own people. Yet even in this dark period of Ethiopian history, we can find evidence of the resilience and courage that have characterized this ancient people throughout their long struggle for dignity and freedom. Students continued to resist despite facing death. Farmers preserved their communities despite forced relocations, and ordinary people maintained their humanity despite living under a regime that sought to destroy all independent thought and action. As we prepare for sleep tonight, we might reflect on the words of those brave Ethiopian students who marched through the streets of Addis Ababa shouting "Land to the tiller," never knowing that their dreams of justice would be twisted into instruments of oppression. Their story reminds us that revolution alone cannot guarantee progress, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit our highest aspirations for their lowest purposes. Chapter 6: Contemporary Ethiopia: Challenges and Transformations. The collapse of Mengistu's military dictatorship in 1991 should have marked the beginning of a new golden age for Ethiopia. After decades of war, famine, and political repression, the Ethiopian people finally had an opportunity to build a democratic society based on justice, prosperity, and ethnic harmony. Yet as we reach the end of our journey through Ethiopian history, we find a country that has achieved remarkable economic growth while struggling with new forms of political tension and conflict. Contemporary Ethiopia is a story of both extraordinary progress and persistent challenges, reminding us that the path to lasting peace is never as simple as we might hope. The new government that took power in 1991 was led by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, a coalition dominated by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front under the leadership of Meles Zenawi. This was a remarkable transformation in Ethiopian politics, as the Tigrayans constituted only about 6% of the population but had played the leading role in overthrowing Mengistu's regime through superior military organization and strategic thinking. Meles Zenawi, who would serve as Ethiopia's leader until his death in 2012, was a fascinating figure who combined intellectual sophistication with pragmatic political skills. Unlike the ideological extremism that had characterized the Derg era, Meles pursued a more measured approach to governance that emphasized economic development, administrative efficiency, and careful management of Ethiopia's complex ethnic diversity. The new government's most ambitious experiment was the establishment of ethnic federalism, a system that divided Ethiopia into 9 regional states, based primarily on ethnic and linguistic identity. This was a radical departure from Ethiopia's historical tradition of centralized rule, reflecting the new leadership's belief that the country's ethnic conflicts could be resolved by giving each group meaningful autonomy within their traditional territories. Under this system, the Oromo people received the largest regional state, Oromia, while the Amhara were given their own region in the north-central highlands. The Tigrayans, Somalis, and Afar each received states corresponding to their traditional homelands, while smaller ethnic groups were grouped together in multi-ethnic regions. Each regional state was granted considerable autonomy over local affairs, including the right to use its own language in education and government, while the federal government retained control over national defense, foreign policy, and major economic policies. Ethnic federalism represented a bold attempt to address the grievances that had fueled decades of civil war, but it also created new challenges for Ethiopian unity. Critics argued that organizing the state around ethnic identity would reinforce divisions between groups and make it more difficult to build a common Ethiopian identity. Supporters countered that recognizing ethnic diversity was the only way to create genuine equality and prevent future conflicts. The early results of this experiment were mixed but generally encouraging. The end of civil war allowed resources that had been devoted to military spending to be redirected toward economic development, while the new constitution guaranteed basic human rights and promised eventual democratization. International donors, impressed by Ethiopia's stability and reformist rhetoric, provided substantial aid for reconstruction and development programs. Most importantly, Ethiopia began to experience sustained economic growth for the first time in decades. The new government prioritized agricultural development, rural education, and infrastructure construction, policies that began to improve living standards for ordinary Ethiopians. By the 2000s, Ethiopia was being celebrated as one of Africa's economic success stories, with GDP growth rates consistently exceeding 7% annually. However, this economic progress came at a political cost. The EPRDF maintained tight control over the political system, systematically marginalizing opposition parties and restricting civil liberties whenever they threatened the ruling party's dominance. The government justified these authoritarian tendencies by arguing that Ethiopia needed strong leadership to maintain stability and continue economic development, but critics increasingly viewed the regime as another form of dictatorship disguised by democratic rhetoric. The limitations of Ethiopian democracy became starkly apparent during the 2005 elections, when opposition parties won significant support in urban areas and appeared poised to make major gains. The government's response was swift and harsh. Opposition leaders were arrested, protesters were shot by security forces, and civil liberties were severely restricted. The international community condemned these actions, but the EPRDF maintained power and continued its development programs with minimal interference. Despite these political problems, Ethiopia continued to experience impressive economic growth under Meles Zenawi's leadership. The government invested heavily in roads, telecommunications, and hydroelectric power, while encouraging foreign investment in manufacturing and agriculture. Ethiopia became a significant player in international peacekeeping operations, contributing troops to missions in Sudan and Somalia, and Addis Ababa emerged as a major diplomatic center hosting the headquarters of the African Union. The death of Meles Zenawi in 2012 marked a crucial transition point for Ethiopia. His successor, Hailemariam Desalegn, was a competent administrator but lacked the political skills and personal authority that had enabled Meles to manage Ethiopia's complex ethnic politics. Under Hailemariam's leadership, long-suppressed tensions began to emerge as various ethnic groups became increasingly frustrated with Tigrayan dominance of the political system. The most serious challenge came from the Oromo people, Ethiopia's largest ethnic group, who felt that they had been marginalized despite their demographic weight. Beginning in 2015, massive protests erupted across Oromia in response to government plans to expand Addis Ababa's municipal boundaries into Oromo territory. These protests quickly expanded beyond the initial grievance to encompass broader demands for political reform and greater Oromo representation in the federal government. The government's response to these protests followed a familiar pattern of repression and violence, but this time the strategy failed to restore stability. Protests spread to Amhara regions and other parts of the country, while international pressure mounted for meaningful political reform. By 2017, it had become clear that the EPRDF's authoritarian approach was no longer sustainable, and Hailemariam Desalegn announced his resignation in an attempt to facilitate political transition. The selection of Abiy Ahmed as Ethiopia's new prime minister in 2018 marked the beginning of the most dramatic political transformation in Ethiopia since 1991. Abiy, a young Oromo politician with a mixed ethnic background and charismatic speaking style, promised sweeping reforms that would democratize Ethiopian politics and resolve the country's ethnic conflicts through dialogue rather than repression. Abiy's initial reforms were indeed breathtaking in their scope and speed. He released thousands of political prisoners, lifted restrictions on media freedom, invited exiled opposition groups to return home, and appointed women to half of his cabinet positions. Most dramatically, he reached out to Eritrea's president Isaias Afwerki and negotiated a peace agreement that officially ended the 20-year stalemate between the two countries. The international community was euphoric about these developments, viewing Abiy as a new generation of African leader who could demonstrate that democratic transitions were possible even in deeply divided societies. In 2019, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his peace initiative with Eritrea and his broader efforts to promote reconciliation and reform within Ethiopia. Yet even as Abiy was being celebrated internationally, serious problems were developing within Ethiopia. His reforms had unleashed political forces that proved difficult to control, while his attempts to move away from ethnic federalism toward a more centralized system alarmed many groups who feared losing their recently gained autonomy. The Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, in particular, viewed Abiy's changes as a direct threat to the federal system they had created and their own political survival. In 2019, Abiy dissolved the EPRDF coalition and replaced it with a new prosperity party that was designed to transcend ethnic divisions and create a unified national political organization. This decision was intended to promote Ethiopian unity, but it effectively excluded the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, which refused to join the new party and retreated to its regional stronghold in northern Ethiopia. The tension between Abiy's government and the TPLF escalated throughout 2020, particularly after the federal government postponed national elections due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Tigrayan regional government held its own elections in defiance of federal authority, setting the stage for a constitutional crisis that would soon spiral into open warfare. On November 4th, 2020, fighting broke out between federal forces and the Tigrayan regional military, marking the beginning of a devastating civil war that would continue for 2 years and cause hundreds of thousands of deaths. The conflict drew in Eritrean forces supporting the federal government, while various ethnic militias became involved on different sides, creating a complex and brutal war that devastated northern Ethiopia. The Tigray War represented everything that ethnic federalism had been designed to prevent: ethnic violence on a massive scale, the breakdown of political dialogue, and the use of military force to resolve political disputes. International observers documented evidence of war crimes committed by all sides, including mass killings of civilians, widespread sexual violence, and the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. The humanitarian consequences of the conflict were staggering. Millions of people were displaced from their homes, while government blockades prevented humanitarian aid from reaching areas controlled by Tigrayan forces. Famine conditions emerged in parts of Tigray, echoing the disasters of the 1980s, but this time caused by deliberate government policies rather than natural drought. International pressure eventually forced a ceasefire agreement in November 2022, but the war had fundamentally transformed Ethiopian politics and society. The optimism that had greeted Abiy's rise to power was replaced by profound disillusionment, both within Ethiopia and among international observers who had invested so much hope in his reforms. Today's Ethiopia faces enormous challenges as it attempts to recover from this latest period of conflict and division. The federal system remains in crisis, with various ethnic groups questioning whether peaceful coexistence is possible within a single state. Economic progress has been reversed by war spending and international sanctions, while the government struggles to maintain legitimacy after the brutality of the Tigray conflict. Yet, Ethiopia's history suggests that this ancient nation possesses remarkable resilience and an ability to reinvent itself even after the darkest periods. The same people who survived the horrors of the Derg era and built a functioning state from its ruins may yet find ways to address their current challenges through dialogue, compromise, and mutual recognition of their shared humanity. Contemporary Ethiopia contains all the contradictions and complexities that have characterized this remarkable country throughout its long history. It is a nation that has never been successfully colonized by foreign powers, but has repeatedly colonized itself through internal conflicts. It is a country with a proud heritage of independence and dignity that struggles to extend those benefits equally to all its citizens. It is a society that has produced extraordinary achievements in art, architecture, and civilization, while also witnessing some of the 20th century's worst human rights abuses. Perhaps most importantly, Ethiopia today is a country of young people who have inherited both the blessings and the curses of their ancestors' choices. Over 70% of Ethiopians are under 30 years of age, meaning that most of the population has no personal memory of the imperial era or even the Derg period. These young Ethiopians are more educated, more connected to the wider world, and more impatient with ethnic divisions than previous generations. Whether Ethiopia can fulfill the hopes of its young people while honouring the legitimate grievances of its diverse ethnic communities remains the central challenge facing the country today. The answers will determine not only Ethiopia's own future, but may also influence the broader trajectory of African development and the possibility of building inclusive democracies in ethnically diverse societies around the world. As we conclude our journey through Ethiopia's extraordinary history, we can take comfort in the knowledge that this is a people who have faced seemingly impossible challenges before and found ways to survive, adapt, and ultimately prosper. From the ancient kingdoms of Aksum through the medieval glory of Lalibela, from the victories of Adwa through the struggles of the modern era, Ethiopians have repeatedly demonstrated that human dignity and determination can overcome even the greatest obstacles. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you might imagine the sounds of modern Addis Ababa, the honking of traffic, the calls of street vendors, the laughter of children walking to school. In these everyday sounds lies the hope that ordinary Ethiopians, regardless of their ethnic background or political affiliations, can find ways to build a future together that honours their past while creating new possibilities for peace, prosperity, and justice. The story of Ethiopia is far from over, and perhaps its greatest chapters are yet to be written.